All right. Hope everybody had a good break. 20 minutes is solid, I'd say, to sort of reboot the mind. Hopefully now we can move forward together to really understand what all these little moving parts were that we put together. What they are is just components of this model that's meant to help us to understand the nature of the impact that investment spending has on the overall level of functioning of the economy, which we measure via GDP, right? The value of all that's produced, which is also the value of all the income that goes into folks' pockets, which is also the value of all the spending that occurs in the economy. All right, so first a quick recap of some of the important assumptions we're working under. The first one, again, is that changes in the overall spending lead to changes in aggregate output. So we don't think about changes in prices at all. If people are spending more, then there's going to be more output. And so we're thinking in real terms here. So we assume that producers are willing to supply additional output at a fixed price level. Changes in spending translate into changes in output rather than moves of the overall price level up or down. So these assumptions are just essentially there to help you understand the simplicity of the model we're using to understand the complexity of the economy. The assumptions themselves you don't need to know backwards and forwards, but in order to understand why the model maybe doesn't include government and why we're not talking about prices and interest rates, you just need to keep in mind, we're making assumptions that these things aren't important for what we're showing, but it doesn't mean that they don't influence it in reality. It's just we don't need to have that level of complexity to sort of zero in on the effect we're looking to analyze. So again, just as far as this assumption goes, the fixed aggregate price level implies that there's no difference between the nominal GDP and real GDP, so we use the terms interchangeably in this chapter. We also assume that the interest rate is fixed, so the interest rate is not changing. Taxes, government transfers, and government purchases are all zero, and exports and imports are also zero. So those are the assumptions we're working under in this simplified world in order to be able to understand the effects that investment spending has on the level of GDP in the economy and the process by which the economy adjusts to changes of investment spending via the multiplier. All right, so we talked about consumption spending and we talked about investment spending. Investment spending is a sum of both planned investment spending and unplanned inventory investment spending. Those two together equal actual investment spending. We talked about consumption. Consumption being a function of disposable income. The amount that folks wind up consuming is dependent on the marginal propensity to consume. Putting consumption and investment spending together in this economy, this simplified economy, in which those are the only two forms of spending, we're not considering government spending, and we're not considering spending by individuals on goods coming in from the other countries' exports, and us spending goods on goods coming out of the, or folks spending money on our goods exports. So we're not looking at imports and exports. We're just looking at consumption and investment as the only spending in this economy. So again, in an economy with no government and no foreign trade, there's only two sources of aggregate spending, and that's consumption spending and investment spending. Assuming that there's no taxes nor transfers means that disposable income equals GDP. All spending is equal to income, and disposable income is normally considered to be income minus taxes plus transfers, but there's no government, so there's no taxes nor transfers here. But it doesn't mean that disposable income isn't still defined the way it is in general. But in this chapter, again, in order to understand the simple model we're looking at, we've made these simplifying assumptions. So there's two basic equations of national income accounting in this economy. So we looked at national income accounting in a prior chapter as being GDP equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus I. Here we have, because all those other things aren't being taken into consideration, we only have consumption and investment spending, and so GDP is equal to consumption plus investment spending. GDP equals C plus I. And also, disposable income equals GDP. So YP equals GDP because there's no taxes and no transfers. The aggregate consumption function is still assumed to be equal to this expression here, where consumption equals autonomous spending plus the marginal propensity to consume times disposable income. In this simplified model, we assume that planned investment spending, I planned, is fixed. The last concept to be introduced for the model is planned aggregate spending. Planned aggregate spending is the total amount of planned spending in the economy. So we denote aggregate planned spending as AE subscript planned. Planned aggregate spending. So planned aggregate spending is equal to the sum of consumption plus planned investment spending. So this is a standard sort of way of sort of learning about a model. You got to like establish the nature of all the relationships, establish like equations that relate the variables that you've defined very clearly. We've talked about the effects that shift some of these relationships, and now we're sort of summing up the model in the equations based on all the information we have, and thus these four equations are basically the model we're working with here. All right, so the level of planned aggregate expenditure depends on the level of real GDP that year. So if real GDP is equal to 0, that means disposable income is equal to 0, but there's still going to be some amount of autonomous consumption. So that's 300 billion in this case. There's some amount of planned investment spending, which is 500 billion. And so planned aggregate expenditure, planned aggregate spending is equal to 800 billion, the sum of those two. Let's say real GDP is equal to 500. That means that there will be 500 billion in disposable income that year. That's going to be multiplied by the marginal propensity to consume, which will add, in this case, 300 billion to consumption. And then we still have the planned investment spending. We're assuming planned investment spending is fixed at 500 billion. And so planned aggregate expenditure is going to be the sum of consumption spending plus planned investment spending, which is equal to 1,100. So real GDP is equal to 500 billion, and planned expenditure, aggregate expenditure, is equal to 1,100. So there's more expenditure happening in this economy than the amount of real GDP that's been produced at this level. And that occurs at all of these up until this one here, in which real GDP is equal to planned aggregate expenditure. And beyond that point, planned aggregate expenditure will be less than real GDP. This is just an example of how these numbers could go, and sort of elucidating the relationship between them based on the equations that make up this simplified economy that we're looking at. So what's happening as far as consumption is based on this sample aggregate consumption function. We know there's a 300 billion level of autonomous spending. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, so we can see here that there's 500 billion in real GDP, which then becomes disposable income. If we multiply that by 0.6, 60% of 500 is equal to 300, which is the extra 300 in consumer spending that was added to the autonomous level. That got consumption spending to 600 there. And then that continues on as we go down. If you multiply this by 0.6, then you'll get to this number minus 300. So this is going to be 600. Obviously, 1,000 times 0.6 is equal to 600 plus 300. All right, now that table can also be represented graphically via the aggregate expenditure function. So the aggregate expenditure function is basically just a shifted up consumption function, aggregate consumption function. So remember, we're talking about like all the spending that goes on in the economy, the aggregate expenditure, and we said that in the simplified world, there's only consumption and there's investment spending. And so what that means is that this line is just going to be shifted up by the amount of investment spending to get us to the aggregate expenditure. So we know the consumption function, the aggregate consumption function equals 300 plus 0.6 times YD, so 300 plus the marginal propensity to consume times disposable income. The planned aggregate expenditure we assume to be 500 billion, and that's fixed. And so therefore that shifts up the amount of autonomous spending in the economy. So the intercept of this line is increased. And so when we sum up the consumption spending plus the planned investment spending, we wind up with our planned aggregate expenditure, planned aggregate spending function, which is the final relationship that we've been trying to get to. So the planned aggregate expenditure function is the consumption function shifted up by the amount of investment spending. If there was government spending, then that would be shifted up also by the government spending. If there was a difference between exports and imports, X minus IM, then if that was positive, that would shift it up as well, and therefore aggregate planned expenditure would still embody all of those, but we leave them out just to simplify it so we understand what this can explain for us. And we're not there yet as far as like what it can explain for us. I'm still kind of setting up the framework for it. But I'm trying to go slowly so those of you that are like kind of tracking the whole thing, you're getting it. All right, so based on this table that we were looking at, for all production levels except one, real GDP is more or less than the planned aggregate expenditure. So again, I already talked about how that's the only point where real GDP was equal to planned aggregate expenditure. And beyond this point, going up, we have planned aggregate expenditure that was greater than real GDP. And then below this row, we have planned aggregate expenditure that's less than real GDP. So this difference between real GDP and planned aggregate expenditure at most levels can be attributed to unplanned aggregate spending, or also what we know to be unplanned inventory investment spending. So over here, there was nothing produced, but there was a lot more spending. That means that people were buying things that were already produced, that were in factories, that were in warehouses, that were in inventories. And so when you have a situation like that, you have negative unplanned inventory investment spending because you're taking inventory out of the warehouses to sell in the economy, and so you have negative unplanned inventory investment spending, in this case of 800 billion. But over here, we have a shortfall of spending to how much was produced in the economy, and therefore, in this case, we have a difference of 400 billion, and therefore, that extra 400 billion that was not purchased during that period goes into warehouses, right? And so therefore, you have positive unplanned inventory investment spending. So over time, the economy moves to a situation in which there is no unplanned spending, aggregate spending. So that is what's going to trigger a movement in GDP in the economy, the amount of unplanned inventory investment spending, whether it be negative or positive. So the situation is called the income expenditure equilibrium, the point at which the real GDP is equal to planned aggregate expenditure. That is the equilibrium. That is the point that the economy is always trying to get to. It always wants to be at that point. But things in the economy, things in our world complicate life and therefore shift this relationship and take us out of equilibrium, which then causes us to adjust. Should we produce more? Should we produce less? And then that'll eventually get us back to that equilibrium where we're producing as much as we are spending. So let's talk about this income expenditure equilibrium. Planned aggregate spending can be different from real GDP only if there is unplanned inventory investment spending in the economy. So you've got GDP equal to consumption plus investment spending. We know that investment spending is equal to unplanned inventory investment spending and planned investment spending. So therefore, GDP is equal to consumption plus unplanned inventory investment spending and planned investment spending. We know that aggregate expenditure, planned aggregate expenditure, is equal to consumption plus planned investment spending. And therefore, GDP is equal to, if we plug this relationship into this one, so if we plug this in for these terms into our GDP expression, GDP is then equal to planned aggregate expenditure plus the unplanned inventory investment spending. So at any given period of time, GDP will equal aggregate expenditure planned, and there's going to be some residual amount, either positive or negative, of unplanned inventory investment spending. So if we've produced too much, there'll be positive unplanned inventory investment spending, and if we haven't produced enough, there'll be negative unplanned inventory investment spending. So again, here's that table again, and here is the differential represented as unplanned inventory investment spending. So again, we haven't produced anything in the economy, but we spent 800 billion, and therefore we had to take 800 billion out of our warehouses, so we had negative unplanned inventory investment spending. We produced $1,000 worth of goods here. We actually wound up spending 1,400 billion rather than the 1,000 that we produced in goods, and thus there's a negative 400 billion in goods that we had to take out of our factories to meet demand, and therefore we have negative 400 billion in unplanned inventory investment spending. Over here, we produced $3,000 billion of goods. We only spent $2,600 billion on those goods, and therefore we had 400 billion left over. And therefore that 400 billion left over went into warehouses, so we had positive unplanned inventory investment spending. So firms will act to correct their mistakes and move the economy to the point where real GDP is equal to planned aggregate spending. And that is the point that where the economy is at an equilibrium. It's at a state of rest where it's exactly producing exactly the amount that's being consumed. And so the economy is in this equilibrium when the aggregate output measured by real GDP is equal to planned aggregate spending. The income expenditure equilibrium, and the level of GDP that corresponds to that level is called the income expenditure equilibrium GDP, the level of GDP at which real GDP equals planned aggregate spending. All right, let's look at this graphically. So what you see here is what's called the Keynesian cross. It's the diagram that identifies income expenditure equilibrium as the point where the planned aggregate spending line crosses the 45-degree line. So this 45-degree line is here as just like a point of reference. It's a point of reference that tells us what are all the points at which GDP is exactly equal to planned aggregate expenditure. This line here is the planned aggregate expenditure line. So our 45-degree line has a slope of 1, right? It's 1 to 1. The amount of spending is equal to the amount that's produced. The amount of real GDP is equal to the amount that is spent along that line. So it has a slope of 1. We know that planned aggregate expenditure is just the consumption function shifted up by the level of planned investment spending. And therefore, the slope of that line, which we know to be the marginal propensity to consume, is less than 1. And therefore, this line is going to be flatter. The aggregate expenditure line is going to be flatter than the 45-degree line. And so if we use the 45-degree line as a point of reference, we can identify where we are in the economy at any given point with respect to how much we're producing and how much we are spending. And therefore, we can identify very easily the amount of unplanned inventory investment spending and whether it's positive or negative. And so if you look at this point right here, at this point, we are producing 100 billion in real GDP. Here's our 45-degree line. So, and here's our planned aggregate expenditure line. So therefore, in this case, we're actually spending more than we're producing, and we can just easily identify that by the 45-degree line. And the difference between these two is the amount that we had to take out of our factories to meet the excess demand, because we spent more in the economy during that period than we produced. And therefore, we had over this range here, to the left of the equilibrium, where the economy is at its income expenditure equilibrium, to the left of that point, we're always going to have unplanned inventory investment spending that's going to be negative, because we're always going to be spending more than we're producing. And so we're always going to need to be going into our warehouses and taking stuff out to meet demand, which means we'll always have negative unplanned inventory investment spending. And then to the right of the equilibrium, we see that the 45-degree line is above the aggregate expenditure line, meaning that all the points at which the exact amount we produce is the exact amount we consume are above the line we actually are on, and therefore we are spending less than we're producing. So all along these points to the right of the equilibrium, we're spending less than we're producing. And so the difference between our planned aggregate expenditure points on this line and the 45-degree line represent the amount of excess amount that we are producing that we are not consuming that is going into warehouses, which means that we have positive unplanned inventory investment spending. All right, so there's a process, there's a tendency in our economy to always get us to equilibrium. This is how this works. So in one period, you are, let's say, over here. We've produced 100 billion and we're spending more than that. We're spending 1,400 billion. So we have that negative unplanned inventory investment spending. That means in the next period, I'm going to produce 1,400 billion. So I'm going to go from that 1,400 billion to the 45-degree line to the 1,400 billion that would be around here. So the next period we'll produce 1,400 billion because that's how much was purchased in the last period. But at 1,400 billion, if I go up here, we're still spending more than we're producing. So it's going to be somewhere along here, maybe, I don't know, like 1,700 billion. So then in the next period, we're going to have to produce 1,700 billion. So we go to the 45-degree line to the next period. Each period is like 3 months, let's say. So the next period, we produce 1,700 billion. If we produce 1,700 billion based on our aggregate expenditure line, the actual relationship that represents what's actually happening in the economy, we still see that we are above the amount we're producing. So again, in the next period, we're going to have to produce more, and that process continues on until it gets us to the equilibrium. If we're anywhere to the right of the equilibrium, the same process occurs, but it's in the opposite direction. So let's say we're producing 3,500 billion in real GDP. Well, we see that, of course, our aggregate expenditure line is below the 45-degree line, which means that we are spending less than we're producing. So in the next period, we are going to want to produce less. So we're going to, in this case, 3,500 corresponds to maybe like 2,800 or something. So the next period we'll produce 2,800. But if we produce 2,800, at this point, we're still going to spend less than 2,800. So once again, we're going to have positive unplanned inventory investment spending in 2,800. Of 2,800, the difference between 2,800 and whatever this point is, that is the exact amount that we consume. And so in the next period, we're going to produce less. And so then that's going to keep us going through that same process through various periods and eventually get us down to that point there, that equilibrium. So much like in the supply and demand model, where if you're like above the equilibrium for supply and demand, you have excess supply, and therefore suppliers start to lower their prices, and then that brings you to the equilibrium. And then if you're below the equilibrium, there's excess demand, so then consumers start to bid up the prices. There are forces on either side of this equilibrium always pushing us back to this equilibrium. And so if nothing else is happening in the world and nothing is shifting this relationship, which again, we've seen there are things that can shift it. We talked about them. Expectations of real income changing, expectations of wealth, or changes in wealth changing, changes in the interest rate, all the things that we talked about that could shift this line. If none of that's happening, then the process will get us to the equilibrium and the economy will be at rest and everyone will be happy. But obviously the world is not that simple. We are never really at rest. But the point of this model is to understand that we are always trying to get to this point. Regardless of what's happening in the economy, every period we are either at a point where we are consuming too much or we're producing too much. And the unplanned inventory investment spending, either us taking stuff out of factories or putting stuff into factories, gets us to either produce more or less in each period to the point where eventually we are trying to be at this point where we are producing exactly what we're spending. Yeah.
What's the Y stand for after 2000?
So Y is equal to GDP. Yeah. So again, over to the left of the equilibrium, unplanned inventory investment spending is negative. We are consuming less than we're producing, and so that drives us to increase real GDP. And to the right of the equilibrium, unplanned inventory investment spending is positive. We are producing more than we are spending, and therefore we're putting things into our warehouses, and therefore GDP is falling. It's driving us to drop our GDP, the amount of output, so that we get to the equilibrium. All right, so this was developed by Paul Samuelson, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, a Nobel Prize winner. And he explained the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who was the founder of macroeconomics as we know it. So he came up with this model to sort of explain how spending in the economy can have a big effect on the overall state of the economy, which is something that we sort of like we believe was sort of like a self-correcting process before like macroeconomics was developed, meaning that we wanted to leave the economy to do its own thing. But a model like this can tell us, well, if we are outside of our equilibrium, we can actually increase spending or decrease spending. We can take an active role in spending to be able to then get us to the equilibrium we want. All right, so let's just talk about the relationship between the multiplier process and the inventory adjustment. Let's turn to understanding what happens when there's a shift of the planned aggregate spending line. In our simple model, there's only two possible sources of a shift of the planned aggregate spending line. One is a change in planned investment spending, and the other one is a shift of the aggregate consumption function. We talked about what those effects are that can shift either of those things. So recall that an autonomous change in planned aggregate spending is a change in the desired level of spending by firms, household, and government at any level of real GDP. And so what's going to happen as a result of some autonomous change in spending, like that one that we tracked at the very beginning of this lecture where I said, well, $100 billion were being spent by home builders. That's an autonomous change in investment spending. That will cause us to get to a new equilibrium for the economy, right? So 100 billion led to 250 billion in extra GDP. So then if our aggregate expenditure line shifted up by 100 billion, then our equilibrium GDP went up by 250 billion. So that point shifted to the right by 250 units in billions, just based on that one example that we tracked at the beginning of the lecture. In this example, we have some change in planned aggregate expenditure that's autonomous, and that takes us from the 2,000 in billions of dollars of equilibrium income expenditure to 3,000. So what that looks graphically is, again, we see a shift up of the aggregate expenditure line. So initially we're at this equilibrium here. All of a sudden there's an increase in 400 billion in aggregate spending. That shifts our aggregate expenditure line up. So before we were at this equilibrium, our unplanned inventory investment spending was equal to zero, right, at that point, because the economy was at its equilibrium. It's where it wanted to be. All of a sudden, 400 billion in autonomous spending occurred that shifted our aggregate expenditure line, and therefore at the old equilibrium that we were at, now we're going to be at this point here in terms of spending, which is going to be at a point above the 45-degree line, which again means that at that point now, we are spending more than we're producing. So our GDP is at that point 2,000, but the amount we're spending is going to be 400 billion more, and therefore that 400 billion is now going to take the form of unplanned inventory investment spending, right? It's going to cause us to take 400 billion of inventories out of our warehouses to meet that excess demand that was caused by this new round of spending. And of course, that means that now we're going to have that process whereby in the next period, we're going to produce more, and then that's going to fall short of our spending. So we're going to spend more in the next period again, and that means that we're going to produce more in the next period, and eventually we're going to get up to that new equilibrium, E2. And the difference between 2,000 and 3,000 will again be will be determined by the multiplier. That initial amount of 400 billion in increase in aggregate spending is going to lead to 1,000 billion increase in real GDP, and therefore we have a multiplier of 2.5 there. So the results can be summarized in the equation where the change in autonomous aggregate expenditure planned represents an autonomous change in the change in planned aggregate expenditure, and the change in GDP is equal to the difference between the new equilibrium GDP and the old equilibrium GDP. And that represents a change in the income expenditure equilibrium GDP, and therefore the change in the equilibrium GDP is going to equal the multiplier times the change in autonomous aggregate expenditure. Exactly what I just explained, but just in equations. So that amount of 400 billion, that change in autonomous aggregate expenditure planned times our multiplier will get us to the change in real GDP. And we know the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Since the multiplier is greater than 1, we know that the change in equilibrium GDP is greater than the autonomous change in aggregate expenditure. You guys ready for the exam? I like that. I like that spirit. All right, let's do some practice problems. But real quick, like this explains the paradox of thrift. Recall that in the paradox of thrift, households and firms cut their spending in anticipation of future tough economic times, which then causes tough economic times, because using the multiplier, we can see exactly how this scenario unfolds. Suppose there's a slump in consumer spending or investment spending. This causes a fall in income, expenditure equilibrium, GDP that is several times larger than the original fall in spending. So the fall in real GDP leaves consumers and producers worse off than they would have been if they hadn't cut their spending. So people expect spending people expect the economy to get hurt, so they stop spending, and then through the multiplier process, that winds up having a huge hit on how much we actually produce in the economy, which then gets us to this lower level of GDP, and so that is the paradox of thrift. And the multiplier process explains it. All right, let's do a few practice problems to sort of help you sort of work through the model a bit and kind of understand it a little bit better. So this one's on the multiplier and the marginal propensity to consume. If the multiplier equals 4, then the marginal propensity to save must be equal to 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, or the marginal propensity to consume? You don't have to answer. It's all right. This requires a little bit of math. You know, it requires a couple of things. One, it requires you to remember that the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 1, right? And also that the multiplier is equal to what? 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Very good. All right, so the answer here is going to be 1/4. Let's derive it. We know the marginal propensity to consume is the increase in consumer spending when disposable income rises by $1. And the marginal propensity to save is the increase in household savings when disposable income rises by $1. And we know that the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save are equal to 1. We know that autonomous change in aggregate spending is an initial change in the desired level of spending by firms, household, or government at a given level of real GDP. We know that the multiplier is the ratio of the total change in real GDP caused by an autonomous change in aggregate spending to the size of the autonomous change. So the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Now, the marginal propensity to consume is the sum of a geometric series. So a geometric series looks like this, where you have some coefficient. Hey, don't worry, you don't need to know this. I'm just, again, explaining how we get from that process of like they're spending in all these rounds to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Anyway, a geometric series looks like this, where you have some constant, A, that doesn't change, times some variable X that does change. And we're adding these, and that variable is being raised to some exponent, first 0, then 1, then 2, all the way to infinity. You can represent this sum as what's called sigma notation. So this big sum says we're adding up all these terms, and then this thing down here says we're going to start adding them by having n equal 1, and then what this term up here says is that the final term is going to have n equal to infinity, which is what we have here. So that's what sigma notation is. If you have never seen this before and you've maybe glanced at it and were intimidated by it, you shouldn't be intimidated by it. Just understand it. Once you understand it, you get it. Anyway, so if x is less than or equal to 1, in this case, the marginal propensity to consume is what x is, so it is less than or equal to 1, then the sum of this series, as we add all the way to infinity, will equal to a over 1 minus x. So let's say the autonomous spending is equal to 100, and the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.3. Then we're going to have 100 times the marginal propensity to consume raised to the power of 0. Anything raised to the power of 0 is equal to 1, so we're just going to have 100 plus a is equal to 100 again, times the marginal propensity to consume, which is equal to 0.3 raised to the first power, plus 100 times 0.3 from the last period into the second period times the marginal propensity to consume. So we're going to have a times x, which is a marginal propensity to consume squared, and so on and so forth. So this, again, that sum of all those rounds of spending, taking into account that part of what's being spent is being saved via the marginal propensity to consume, does follow the form of the geometric series, and therefore the sum of this series does converge to this. So in this case, the amount of spending is going to be 141.7. A in this case is equal to 100. X is equal to 0.3, the marginal propensity to consume, and therefore the series will converge to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times the amount of that autonomous spending, and that will give us the final effect on real GDP via the multiplier process, which in this case will be equal to 100 times 1 over 0.7, which will get us to 142.6. I know I've complicated things for you a bit here, but it's not complicated. It's just meant to kind of give you a little bit more understanding about what's actually happening as far as the math goes, but nothing's changed. It's exactly the same thing. The multiplier, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, is derived via the geometric series. And so we have 1 over 1 minus. In this case, we are given the multiplier, which is equal to 4, right? So that's what we're given in the problem. It says if the multiplier is equal to 4, then what is the marginal propensity to save? So we're given the multiplier, so we need to solve for the marginal propensity to consume. And then in order to get the marginal propensity to save, you need to subtract the marginal propensity to consume from 1, right, to get the marginal propensity to save. What's that? You got it? Excellent. All right, so the multiplier is equal to 4, so now we just need to do a little bit of algebra here. We multiply both sides by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So it cancels out on the right, and then on the left, we have 4 times 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So the marginal propensity to consume is just the x variable we're solving for, essentially. So we have 4 minus 4 times the marginal propensity to consume. Now we want to solve for marginal propensity to consume. So we will subtract 4 from both sides. So we're left with negative 3 on the right. And now we want to isolate our variable. So we want to divide both sides by negative 4. So therefore, the marginal propensity to consume, when the multiplier is equal to 4, can be solved for to equal 3/4, 0.75. So we know the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So you should be able to solve for the multiplier you should be able to solve for the marginal propensity to consume if you're given the multiplier. And now to get the marginal propensity to save, we know that marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save are equal to 1, and therefore, if we just plug in our marginal propensity to consume to be 3/4, subtract that from 1, what's our marginal propensity to save? 0.25, 1/4. So be able to do this part of it, not the last slide where I tried to demonstrate to you what a geometric series is. Forget that. It's always good to understand things. Like if you're in a class and they just give you an equation, like you should want to understand where it comes from. Don't just take it at face value and say, oh, I got to memorize an equation. Like, okay, I get where this equation comes from. It's from this process and it leads to this. Even if you can't do it yourself, at least if you understand how it comes about, you understand that it wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It means something. Something got to that. And if you're curious enough, which I hope you will be at some point about something in your life, if it's not economics, it's something, you should push hard to try to figure it all out. Whatever it is you're learning, you got to just know it all. You can't let things fall through the cracks. Like, you have to know things. I'm allowed to curse. I'm an adult, you're adults. I keep it clean just in case there's sensitive people in the class, but I'm not afraid to say fuck at any time, and I will say it. I did. Now let's move forward. All right, anyway. So this question is about being able to solve for the marginal propensity to save by just being given the multiplier. So hopefully you are able to do that now, ideally. If not, you will practice it and figure it out. All right, another multiple choice. Increased investment and the multiplier. Suppose that the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.8 and investment spending increases by 100 billion. Then the question is, what is the increase in aggregate demand? Is it 100 billion, the same amount as investment spending? Is it 125 billion, composed of 100 billion in investment spending and 25 billion in consumption? Is it 80 billion, composed of 100 billion in investment spending and a decrease in consumption of 20 billion? Or is it 500 billion, composed of the 100 billion in investment spending and 400 billion in consumption? All right, so in order to figure this out, you're given the marginal propensity to consume, right? So you need to get the multiplier, right? So the answer is going to be D here, and let's figure out why. So we know our multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So we plug in our marginal propensity to consume, then we have 1 over 0.2. That's going to get us to a multiplier of 5. And so therefore we know that 100 billion that's initially spent in investment spending will cause an increase in real GDP of how much? 500 billion, exactly, because our multiplier is equal to 5. So part of that 500 billion is the initial amount of investment spending, and therefore we know the rest of it is 400 billion in consumer spending, consumption spending. So the increase in investment spending is of 100 billion. 100 billion times 5 gives us an increase in aggregate demand. So 500 billion is the final result of that initial amount of investment spending, and it's composed of 100 billion in investment spending and 400 billion in consumption. The model's what it is, folks. I'm just trying to put you through as much of these paces as possible to try to get you to really understand it. But again, you don't learn things in this class by just being exposed to the information once in lecture. You have to go through this stuff again to really get it. Another multiple choice, deriving the individual consumption function. So this table gives us individual and aggregate consumption information for Andy, Fred, and Mark. Their current disposable income is at two levels, either at 0 or 1,000. The first line tells us how much they spend on consumer spending when they have 0 disposable income. And the second line tells us how much they spend in consumer spending when they have $1,000 in disposable income. So the question is, which of the following represents Fred's individual consumption function? And we're given 4 options for the equations. So can somebody tell me which option it is not? Just really quickly. D. It's D. It's not D, right? Because why? We're talking about Fred, right? So there's no intercept there for the consumption function, which represents what? Not aggregate. Autonomous spending, exactly. It represents autonomous spending. We know that at 0 disposable income, that Fred has how much autonomous spending? So obviously that's not there, so therefore D is wrong, right? All right, now let's derive the actual equation, which is A, that is his individual consumption function. All right, so the consumption function again is equal to A plus the marginal propensity to consume times disposable income. So we're given different amounts of some of these things that we need, and we are going to have to solve for one thing that we aren't given. We're not given the marginal propensity to consume. We are given the amount of consumption, we're given the amount of autonomous spending, and we're given the amount of disposable income. So autonomous spending in this case obviously equals $100 for Fred, right? How much is consumption? At a level of $1,000 in disposable income for Fred. It's not 900. It's not all of those. It's just 800 there. It might be hard for you to see. It's what's going on. Anyway. So disposable income is equal to 1,000, and we have consumption spending, which is equal to 800. So if we plug that in for C, we plug A equals 100, we plug YD equals 1,000 into our consumption function, then we just need to solve for the marginal propensity to consume from that. So the marginal propensity to consume is the X variable we're solving for, so you have to use a little bit of algebra. So the first thing we want to do is we want to subtract 100 from both sides. So subtracting 100 from 800 gets us to 700 on the left. And now we want to isolate our marginal propensity to consume, meaning we're solving for the marginal propensity to consume. So we divide both sides by 1,000. And we simplify this to be 0.7. So the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.7. And therefore, our individual consumption function for Fred is equal to C equals 100, the autonomous level of spending, plus the marginal propensity to consume, 0.7 times the disposable income. And that's how you solve for the individual consumption function, given the information on this table. There's a homework problem that asks you to derive marks. So the only person left is Andy. All right, the wealth effect. Multiple choice question 4. An increase in the wealth of households, all other things unchanged, will result in blank the aggregate consumption function. So remember, wealth is savings, right? And so savings is increasing in a household. That means what kind of spending will increase for a consumer? Not aggregate. Autonomous, exactly. So that's going to do what to the consumption function? Increase it. It's going to shift it up, right? So which answer is it? B as in boy is indeed correct. It is going to be an upward shift in the consumption function. Again, the wealth of a household is the value of accumulated savings. The aggregate consumption function is a relationship for the economy as a whole between aggregate consumption, aggregate current disposable income, and aggregate consumer spending, taking that form there. So essentially what's happening is we're just shifting up our autonomous spending by the increase in wealth, which is then going to just shift up our intercept, which shifts up the entire aggregate consumption function. There's two sources of possible shifts. One is a change in aggregate wealth, which again reflects the life cycle hypothesis, which says that consumers plan their spending over a lifetime, not just in response to their current disposable income. So someone who saves will consume more than someone who doesn't. A rise in aggregate wealth increases the vertical intercept A, which in turn shifts the aggregate consumption function up. And of course, the other thing that could have shifted the consumption function is a change in expected future disposable income. If we expect in the future to be more disposable income, then we will spend more today. So autonomous spending will increase and vice versa. And that reflects the permanent income hypothesis, which says that consumer spending ultimately depends mainly on the income people expect to have over the long term rather than on their current income. So in this case, we are shifting the consumption function up versus down, which would be the opposite effect. And that is what happened here. All right, now let's talk about the income expenditure equilibrium. At the income expenditure equilibrium, A, investment net of depreciation is 0. B, planned investment is 0. C, unplanned inventory investment is 0. Or D, inventory investment is 0. How many of you think it's A? How many of you think it's B? How many of you think it's C? How many of you think it's D? C it is. Nice job, folks. You're paying attention. You're learning. I love it. It's nice. I'm not just up here talking for no reason. You're actually listening to me. All right, so we know about the aggregate expenditure model. It's called the Keynesian cross. You've got real GDP on the x-axis. You've got aggregate planned expenditure on the y-axis. We've got this 45-degree line, which is just a reference point for us to understand how the economy might behave when we're not in equilibrium. It represents all the points at which aggregate expenditure is equal to GDP. Aggregate expenditure planned will be flatter than the 45-degree line because the slope of that line is the marginal propensity to consume, which is less than 1. And so there will be a point at which the economy will be in equilibrium in which aggregate expenditure is exactly equal to real GDP. And the question is, why is that in equilibrium? Well, if you're outside of the equilibrium, let's say you're over here, at this point, we're spending more than we are producing. We're producing 100 billion. And so we have spent 300 billion. And so we have, in this case, 200 billion in positive or negative unplanned inventory investment spending? Negative, right? Because we are spending more than we're producing. So there's 200 billion in unplanned inventory investment spending. So in the next period, what we're going to do is we're going to produce that 300 billion. And now it's the next period. We've produced 300 billion, but we've spent 350 billion. And so now in the next period, we have to produce 350 billion, and that process gets us to the equilibrium. And if we're to the right of the equilibrium, we're in a situation where we are spending less than we are producing. And so in this case, we produced 1,800 billion in real GDP, but we've only spent 1,100 billion. And so how much do we have of what? 700 billion in Positive or negative? Positive. What is it? Unplanned inventory, investment spending. It's 4 words. I know it's a lot, but it is what it is. So yes, very good though. We have 700 billion in unplanned inventory investment spending, positive because that much is going into the warehouses. All right, so 1,800 billion produced, only 1,100 billion spent. Therefore, the next period we're only gonna create 1,100 billion in goods, and unfortunately, we're not gonna spend that much the next period, and so we're only gonna spend 900, and therefore the next period we're gonna make 900, and eventually that'll get us to the equilibrium. So again, regardless of whether you're to the right or to the left of the income expenditure equilibrium, the forces in the economy will get us back to that equilibrium point. And that is why this is an equilibrium. All right, aggregate expenditure, another multiple choice question. So in this situation, when real GDP is 700 billion, so real GDP is 700 billion, there will be 125 billion increase in unplanned inventory investment spending, 125 billion decline in unplanned inventory investment spending, 200 billion decline in unplanned inventory investment spending, or 200 billion increase in unplanned inventory investment spending. How many of you think it's A? Oh, you can't read the numbers? Okay, for those of you that can read the numbers, how many of you think it's B? How many of you think it's C? And how many of you think it's D? All right, well, it is in fact A. So pat yourselves in the back, A-listers. You're on the A list from now on. No, we have 700 billion that are being produced. We have 575 billion that's being spent, and therefore we have a difference of 125 billion in excess goods that are going into warehouses. So we have an increase in unplanned inventory investment spending. Very good. Excellent. All right, let's do a practice short answer, and then we'll be done for the day. But please don't forget all of this, because we're going to move on to another model in the next chapter, and we're not covering this again. So that's why I'm going through all this, because I really want you to get it. But again, like, you got to go through stuff several times in this class. Yes? No. They're both unplanned inventory investment spending. Right. There's planned investment and there's unplanned investment, right? We talked about what planned investment is. It's how much firms plan to sell in a given period. But if there's a shortfall, meaning like we produce too much and people aren't spending enough, or we haven't produced enough and people are spending more than we're producing, then there's going to be unplanned inventory investment spending. If we produce too much, there's going to be positive unplanned inventory investment spending, because the too much that wasn't bought is going to go into warehouses. And if we've produced too little and we need to take stuff out of our warehouses, then we have negative unplanned inventory investment spending. We're taking goods out of our warehouses to satisfy demand in that period. I know this stuff. All right, planned investment versus. There was a time where I didn't know it. I was you at one point. I was like, what? It's like, no, video games and movies. Like, stop. But eventually I got it. All right, let's finish off this problem. Practice short answer: planned investment versus unplanned investment. So for each event, explain whether planned investment spending or unplanned inventory investment spending will change and in what direction. An unexpected increase in consumer spending. There's an unexpected increase in consumer spending.
So unplanned.
All right, so remember, aggregate expenditure planned is equal to consumption plus planned investment spending. We know that consumption is equal to this relationship here, which is the consumption function. So we know that aggregate expenditure planned is equal to the consumption function plus the planned investment spending. And so we have, therefore, this one number, which is the planned investment spending, which is added to this. And so that's basically shifting up our intercept for the consumption function. So that's why planned investment spending will shift up the curve to get us to that aggregate expenditure line. And therefore, the rest of the relationship we're looking at, the slope is going to remain the marginal propensity to consume, and the independent variable is the amount of disposable income, which we assume to be equal to GDP because there's no government here. So again, the dependent variable equals this intercept plus the slope times the independent variable. So in this case, autonomous spending has gone up, right? Consumption spending has gone up unexpectedly. So let's say we are at our equilibrium point, and now consumption spending has gone up, which means that what's going to happen to our aggregate expenditure line? It's going to shift up. Exactly. And so at the point we were at, now we've produced this much and we're spending this much, right? And so therefore, at that point, we are going to have what? Negative unplanned inventory investment spending, right? Because now we are taking stuff. A couple of people said it, so you were right to begin with, which is excellent. Yeah, because now we are spending more than we've produced. Because at the beginning of this period, we assumed that this much was going to be produced and therefore spent. But then all of a sudden there was this autonomous increase in consumption spending, which shifted our aggregate expenditure line up, which got us out of equilibrium. And at the point that we've produced, we are spending more than we produce, and therefore we need to take some goods out of our warehouses. So we're going to have negative unplanned inventory investment spending, right? So the aggregate expenditure in this case is greater than the amount we produce. So we are going to have unplanned inventory investment spending, which is going to be negative. You got it?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Shift up.
Alrighty. So again, unexpected increase in consumer spending will result in a reduction in inventories as producers sell items from their inventories to satisfy the short-term increase in demand. This is negative unplanned inventory investment. It reduces the value of producers' inventories. All right, effect 2. A sharp rise in the cost of business borrowing. So what is the cost of borrowing? The interest rate, right? So what has happened to the interest rate? It's gone up. What happens when the interest rate goes up to planned investment? It goes down, right? There's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the amount of planned investment, right? The opportunity cost of investment has gone up, meaning that if I am an investor, now I can invest my money instead of producing, I can put it in a bank and get a higher return on it, right? So therefore, I'm going to want to invest less, right? So what's going to happen to the aggregate expenditure line? Shift down, exactly, right? Planned investment spending is going to decrease. Therefore, the autonomous spending will decrease. That will shift the entire relationship down. So a rise in the cost of borrowing is equivalent to a rise in the interest rate. Fewer investment spending projects are now profitable to producers where they are financed through borrowing or retained earnings. As a result, producers will reduce the amount of planned investment spending. All right. So again, we're trying to identify whether we're going to affect planned investment spending or unplanned inventory investment and what the direction will be. So now we have a third effect, a sharp increase in the economy's growth rate of real GDP. So what is this going to affect? Planned investment spending, right? It's the accelerator principle, right? So a sharp increase in the rate of real GDP growth leads to a higher level of planned investment spending by producers according to the accelerator principle as they increase production capacity to meet higher demand. So again, that's the accelerator principle. A higher growth rate of real GDP leads to higher planned investment spending, but a lower growth rate of real GDP leads to lower planned investment spending. An unanticipated fall in sales. unplanned inventory investment spending, right? And it will be positive, right? Because there's going to be less spending that's going to shift the curve down, and therefore, so here, what's going to happen is autonomous spending has gone down, and so let's say we're at this equilibrium here, the aggregate expenditure line shifts down, and therefore the amount of stuff that we produced in that period is now going to be more than what we're spending in that period, and so then the difference is going to go into our warehouses as what? Positive unplanned inventory investment spending. All right. So yeah, so again, the amount that's spent is going to be less than the amount we produce, the GDP. And so therefore, we're going to have unplanned inventory investment spending, and that is going to be positive. As sales fall, producers sell less and their inventories grow. This leads to positive unplanned inventory investment. All right, folks, nice job. I think you guys got it. Don't forget it, but you probably will forget it. But just remember that you understood it today. And that's really important because when you're studying for the exam, you're just going to be reviewing what you already understood. All right? And that's important. Have a great week. I'll see you next week. I'll open up the homework for this chapter. And it'll be due on Sunday night. Okay. Have a good night.